Chapter 1. The Crooked Streets of Dreams. In a small and restless corner of the city, just west of Washington Square, there was a neighborhood where the streets seemed to have minds of their own. They twisted suddenly, curved back upon themselves, and broke into narrow passages that led nowhere in particular. No road followed a straight line for long, and a stranger walking there might feel as if the city were quietly rearranging itself behind his back. These crooked streets belonged to Greenwich Village, a place that refused to obey rules, whether of direction, ambition, or fate. It was a place where painters arrived with empty pockets and full hearts, where dreamers rented small rooms with tall windows, hoping that light alone could make them rich. The buildings were old and tired, but they welcomed those who lived inside them. Here, art mattered more than certainty, and hope mattered more than money. People came because they could afford to stay, and they stayed because they believed they might one day become something more. Sue and Johnsy found their way to this place in the spring. They met by accident in a modest restaurant on 8th Street, where artists gathered not because the food was good, but because it was cheap. Sue was from Maine, quiet and thoughtful, with a steady way of seeing the world. Johnsy had come from California, carrying sunlight in her smile and ambition in her eyes. As they talked over a simple meal, they discovered how strangely alike they were. They liked the same paintings, the same colors, the same music, and even the same simple dishes. Before the evening ended, they decided, almost without discussion, that they should live and work together. By spring's end, they had rented a small flat at the top of a 3-story building in Greenwich Village. The rooms were plain, but the windows were wide, and the light poured in generously. To Sue and Johnsy, it felt like possibility itself had moved in with them. Through summer and early autumn, their days passed quietly and hopefully. They painted, shared ideas, and imagined futures that stretched far beyond the narrow streets below. Sometimes they sold a sketch, sometimes they didn't. It did not matter much then. They were young, together, and full of belief, but winter came early that year. It arrived not with loud storms, but with a silent visitor that moved unseen through the village. No one heard his footsteps, yet his presence was felt everywhere. He touched one person, then another, leaving behind weakness, fever, and breath that came too slowly. Doctors called him pneumonia, but to those who lived in fear of him, he felt less like an illness and more like a cold, deliberate stranger. In the crowded districts of the city, he moved quickly, claiming many lives in a short time. But in Greenwich Village, where the streets were narrow and the buildings close, he lingered longer, as if choosing carefully whom to visit. One night, he touched Johnsy. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a chill. Then came the fever, the exhaustion, the weakness that refused to lift. Within days, Johnsy lay still in her bed, barely moving, her face pale against the pillow. The doctor came and went, his expression serious, his words carefully chosen. Sue watched him closely, searching his face for hope. Johnsy no longer spoke of paintings or of Italy. She no longer laughed at Sue's small jokes or plans. Instead, she lay quietly, her eyes turned toward the single window in their room. Outside that window stood the brick wall of the next building, close enough to feel like a second prison wall. Against it climbed an old ivy vine, its branches dark and thin, its leaves already touched by the breath of winter. Day after day, Johnsy stared at that wall and the vine, as if it held answers Sue could not give. One morning, the doctor asked Sue to step into the hallway alone. "She has a very small chance," he said gently. "Only if she wants to live. When a patient begins to believe death is certain, half of my work becomes useless." Sue felt her throat tighten. "She's been quiet," she said. "She doesn't seem afraid, just tired." "Does she have something troubling her?" the doctor asked. "A worry? A disappointment?" Sue shook her head. She always dreamed of painting Italy, the Bay of Naples. "Dreams can return," the doctor replied, "but not without hope. Talk to her about the future, about winter clothes, about next spring. Give her something to reach for." After he left, Sue went into the workroom and cried where Johnsy could not hear her. Then she wiped her eyes, picked up her painting materials, and walked back into the bedroom, forcing herself to sing softly as she worked. Johnsy lay still, her face turned toward the window. Sue thought she was asleep until she heard a low voice. 12. Sue paused. 11. Sue looked up from her canvas, confused. 10. 9. She crossed the room quickly and stood beside the bed. Johnsy's eyes were wide open, fixed on the ivy vine outside. "What are you counting, dear?" Sue asked gently. "Leaves," Johnsy whispered. "They're falling." Sue followed her gaze. The cold wind had stripped most of the vine bare. Only a few dark leaves clung to the branches now, trembling. "When the last one falls," Johnsy said, her voice barely a breath, "I will go too." Sue felt fear rise inside her like a wave. She took Johnsy's hand firmly. "That's nonsense," she said, though her voice shook. "That vine has nothing to do with you. You're going to get well." Johnsy did not answer. She continued to watch the leaves, her grip on the world loosening with each one that dropped. Outside, winter settled deeper into Greenwich Village, and the crooked streets grew quiet. Inside the small room at the top of the building, two young women faced something far colder than the season itself. And somewhere below them, in the shadows of the same building, an old man listened to the wind and dreamed of a masterpiece he had never painted. Chapter 2. Counting the falling leaves, the room grew quieter as Johnsy's strength faded, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Outside her window, the world continued without concern, but inside, time moved differently, as if it were afraid to disturb her fragile breathing. She lay still beneath thin blankets, her face pale against the pillow, her eyes fixed on the narrow strip of wall visible through the glass. Sue noticed it first, not the sickness in Johnsy's body, but the sickness in her thoughts. Johnsy was no longer watching the world, she was counting it. At first, Sue thought her friend was whispering nonsense brought on by fever, but when she leaned closer, she heard numbers spoken softly, each one weaker than the last, as though saying them required more strength than Johnsy had left. Sue followed Johnsy's gaze out the window and saw the old ivy vine clinging stubbornly to the brick wall. Its branches were thin and dark, its leaves yellowed and trembling in the cold wind. Autumn had stripped most of them away, and winter was finishing the work with quiet cruelty. Johnsy's eyes moved slowly from leaf to leaf, her lips forming numbers, as another one broke free and drifted down. She spoke as though she were describing something ordinary, something inevitable. She said that when the last leaf fell, she would fall with it. Sue felt a chill deeper than the winter air. This was not fear speaking, it was certainty. Johnsy had already made peace with the idea of leaving, and that frightened Sue more than the illness itself. Sue tried to argue, to laugh, to dismiss the thought as foolishness, but her words felt weak against Johnsy's belief. She told her friend that leaves had nothing to do with life, that doctors knew better than vines and walls. She spoke of food, of warmth, of recovery. But Johnsy barely listened. Her mind was anchored to that vine, as if her soul had tied itself to those fading leaves. Each one that fell loosened her grip on the world. When the doctor came again, his expression was honest, but troubled. He spoke quietly to Sue outside the room, careful not to let Johnsy hear. He explained that the body could still be saved, but the spirit was slipping away. Medicine could fight pneumonia, but it could not fight a will that had already surrendered. He told Sue that hope was as necessary as food, that interest in tomorrow mattered as much as treatment today. Sue nodded, holding back tears, realizing that love alone might not be enough. Back in the room, Sue sat beside Johnsy and forced herself to remain calm. She talked about clothes she would paint in spring, about trips they would take, about a future Johnsy no longer believed in. She begged her to close her eyes, to stop counting. To rest, Johnsy agreed only half-heartedly, her promise fragile and uncertain. Even with her eyes closed, she seemed to sense the leaves falling, as though her heart were counting for her. Sue stepped into the hall and let her tears fall freely. She had fought poverty, long hours, and loneliness since coming to Greenwich Village. But this battle felt crueler than all the others. She understood then that this was not just a sickness of the lungs. It was a sickness of hope. And hope, once broken, was harder to heal than any wound. It was then that Sue thought of Berman. Old Berman lived on the ground floor of the building, a man worn down by years of disappointment. He had come to Greenwich Village long before Sue and Johnsy, carrying dreams that never quite took shape. He spoke often of a masterpiece he would one day paint, yet 40 years had passed without one. Still, beneath his rough voice and heavy drinking, there was a heart that cared fiercely for the young artists in the building, especially Johnsy. Sue found him in his dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of paint and regret. When she told him about Johnsy and the leaves, his anger flared, not at Sue, but at the idea itself. He cursed the thought that a young life could be tied to something so fragile and meaningless. He raged against fate, against sickness, against the cruel imagination that had taken hold of Johnsy's mind. Yet beneath his anger was fear, the kind that comes from caring too deeply. Sue explained that the illness had planted the idea in Johnsy's weakened mind, that reasoning alone could not pull it out. She confessed her fear that when the last leaf fell, Johnsy would follow. Berman fell silent then, his eyes narrowing, as if something inside him had awakened. He muttered about the cold, about the storm that was coming, about things unsaid. And though Sue did not yet understand, a decision was forming in his heart. That night, the wind grew louder, rattling windows and tearing at the remaining leaves. Rain mixed with sleet, striking the building with relentless force. Sue stayed close to Johnsy, listening to her breathing, watching her chest rise and fall. She feared that by morning, both the leaves and her friend would be gone. Each gust of wind felt like a countdown reaching its final number. Johnsy slept restlessly, caught between fevered dreams and waking despair. Even in sleep, her brow remained tense, as though she were still counting. Sue sat beside her, powerless but unwilling to give up. Outside, the storm carried away the last of autumn, stripping the world bare. And somewhere in the darkness below, an old painter prepared to create the only thing he had ever truly believed in. As the night deepened, the battle between despair and hope reached its quiet climax. One belief insisted that life was finished, that letting go was easier than fighting. The other clung stubbornly to the idea that even one small sign, a single leaf, could change everything. And though no one in that room could yet see it, the fate of Johnsy no longer rested with the falling leaves, but with the courage of those who refused to let her believe that hope had vanished. Chapter 3. The last leaf, the night arrived without mercy. Wind howled through the narrow streets of Greenwich Village, slipping between buildings like a living thing searching for warmth. Rain struck the windows with sharp, impatient fingers, and now and then the sound of sleet joined in, tapping the glass like a warning. Inside the small room at the top of the building, Sue sat close to Johnsy's bed, listening to the storm as if it were an enemy she could not fight. Johnsy lay very still, her breathing shallow, her face turned slightly toward the covered window. Sue had pulled the curtain tight, afraid of what the morning might reveal. She feared the wall outside more than the sickness inside the room. Every strong gust of wind made her heart tighten, imagining another leaf breaking free, drifting downward, taking Johnsy's hope with it. She held Johnsy's hand through the long hours, whispering words that felt small against the roar of the storm. Downstairs, in a darker and colder room, old Berman prepared quietly. He did not speak of what he planned to do. He did not boast, as he so often had when talking about his masterpiece. Instead, he gathered his paints, his brushes, and a small lantern. The storm did not frighten him. What frightened him was the thought of a young life slipping away because of a foolish, fragile belief. If a leaf could take hope away, then perhaps a leaf could give it back. The rain soaked the streets, and the cold cut through even the thickest coats. Berman stepped outside into the night, his old body bent against the wind. The wall loomed above him, wet and dark, the ivy vine nearly bare. Somewhere above, Sue and Johnsy waited, unaware of the quiet act of courage unfolding below their window. With shaking hands and stubborn resolve, Berman lifted his brush and began to paint, each stroke fighting against the storm, against age, against the weakness in his own lungs. Upstairs, Sue barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the vine stripped bare, the wall empty, Johnsy's eyes opening to see nothing left. She prayed silently, not for miracles, but for strength, for just one more chance. The storm raged on, hour after hour, until finally the darkness began to thin, and morning crept in, pale and uncertain. Johnsy was the first to speak. Her voice was weak but firm, as if she had been waiting for this moment all night. She said she wanted to see the leaves. Sue's heart sank, but she did not argue. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she pulled the curtain aside. Light entered the room, soft and grey. The wall stood just as it always had, and there, against the bricks, clung a single ivy leaf. It was dark green near the stem, edged with yellow, worn but unbroken. It had endured the wind, the rain, the cold night that should have torn it away. It hung there quietly, refusing to fall. Sue stared in disbelief, afraid to breathe. Johnsy stared too, her eyes wide, something unfamiliar stirring behind them. She said nothing for a long time. She simply looked. Hours seemed to pass in that silence, as though the world itself had paused to watch her decision. The leaf remained. It did not tremble. It did not surrender. Something shifted inside Johnsy then, something slow and fragile, like the first crack of ice in spring. She spoke at last, her voice filled with a quiet shame. She said she had been wrong. She said it was selfish to want to die. If the leaf could hold on through such a night, then perhaps she could hold on too. Sue felt tears rise, but this time they were not tears of fear. She smiled through them as Johnsy asked for food, as she asked for a mirror, as she asked to sit up and watch Sue cook. These were small requests, ordinary things, but to Sue they felt like miracles greater than any painted leaf. As the day passed, color returned slowly to Johnsy's face. She spoke of the future again, hesitantly at first, then with growing strength. She spoke of Italy, of sunlight on water, of the Bay of Naples she still dreamed of painting one day. Sue listened, hardly daring to believe that hope had returned so quietly, carried on the stubborn strength of a single leaf. The doctor came that afternoon and examined Johnsy carefully. His expression changed as he spoke, surprise giving way to relief. He told Sue that the danger had passed, that care and nourishment would now do the rest. As he turned to leave, he mentioned another patient in the building, an old painter, very ill with pneumonia, taken to the hospital earlier that day. Sue felt a sudden, cold weight settle in her chest. The next day, the news came softly, as though the world itself understood the gravity of it. Berman was gone. He had survived only 2 days after falling ill. The storm had taken more from him than the cold could spare. People spoke of finding him soaked through, his clothes icy, his shoes wet, his body worn out. They wondered where he had been that terrible night, what had driven an old man into such weather. Sue waited until evening to tell Johnsy. She sat beside her bed and wrapped an arm around hers gently. Then she told her everything: the lantern, the paints, the wall, the storm. She told her that the leaf outside the window was not a leaf at all. It had never fallen because it had never grown there. It was painted, carefully, lovingly, on the wall during the wildest night of the storm. Johnsy turned toward the window, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at the leaf again, truly seeing it for the first time. It was not nature that had saved her. It was sacrifice. It was love shaped into paint. It was the masterpiece Berman had spoken of for 40 years, finally completed not for fame or fortune, but for one fragile life. The room fell silent, heavy with understanding. Berman's life had ended, but his purpose had not. He had given his breath so that another might keep hers. The leaf remained on the wall, quiet and unchanging, a symbol stronger than words, a reminder that hope does not always arrive as light or warmth. Sometimes it comes disguised as persistence. Sometimes it is painted in the dark during a storm by someone who refuses to let despair have the final word. And in that small room in Greenwich Village, life chose to stay.